Okay, so in an effort to catch up with the new Columbia Noirs before they leave the Criterion Channel, I've been watching them. And one of them is one that you watched because it's a San Francisco movie, and one that you really liked is called The Sniper.
Yes. And I'm
And
looking, I almost,
so
no, keep going.
It's from 1952. It's unfortunately not easy to. I think it's basically on the Criterion Channel and it's leaving. And I am so far behind on these podcasts that this is not going to be up by any day soon. So if you saw it, good. If you didn't, I hope it shows up somewhere. Maybe you can find a copy of it somewhere. This movie is really interesting.
It's a really solid little movie. I mean,
Yeah.
we've both been talking about, like, why don't more people know about it? I mean, it's not like it's a Citizen Kane or The Room or anything like that, but it's like...
It's just a really solid, good movie. I'm weirdly, when I think about it, I'm like, yeah, why don't more people know about it? And on top of that, it's like, so there's so much interest in true crime right now that when I think about it, it's like, so The Sniper is part of the Columbia Noir series, but something I talked about in my post and that we've talked about is like, it's really more of a true crime movie. It's in the noir collection because it's from that era. It's by Columbia. It has some of the conventions of that some of the conventions of that genre. But like, it's really a true crime movie because we're following, and spoilers, we're following our lead, who is a guy who obviously has some issues with women.
Well, we're told that by the title cards. The title cards just straight up state it.
Almost, yeah. It almost feels like a Law and Order thing. Like, these are the whatever of this particular area and blah, blah, blah. It's like that kind of like, it's almost like an ID show thing. And then we go into the movie, and it's our guy, and he's got so we know he's a deviant already, but then we see him like acting poorly towards women, and it's like they're not doing any. I mean, I guess some of them are being kind of mean to him, but in like the vaguest of ways, in the kind of way where it's like,
it's hard to tell if you're not just seeing it from his POV.
Yeah, like you could be seeing it from his perspective, and it's really, and it's also shot in a way where it's a man on the street. The camera's kind of always on the street. There's not a lot of big crane tracking shots. It's often sort of from our main guy's point of view, or at least something near it. It's often just straight, just multiple people in a frame sort of on the street. I read something, somebody called it documentary style. And I'm like, yeah, I think this might've been more common documentary style back then. It doesn't quite look documentary style to me now, but, and it's interesting. Like it's shot that way. It's about just this guy and his hatred towards women. And it's just him escalating and going until he cracks and then starts murdering people. And it's about the police trying to find him. And it's loose. There's not really a big narrative. The narrative is like, here's a guy who's devolving, and here are some police who are trying to catch him.
And you stop following him for chunks of time, and you end up with the police, and you end up with the
like this. I feel
psychiatrist or whoever that is. You kind of watch everyone around him fail to do anything about him.
I wonder where this sits in cinematic and television lineage, as far as like, what's that show from that? What's the show from that era called that spoofed in LA Confidential?
Dragnet?
Yeah. Do you know when that's from?
Did that start as a radio show?
Because like this because The Sniper is 1952, and I think Dragnet has got to be around the same time.
Well, Naked City, I just looked up, is earlier. And I don't think you've ever watched The Naked City.
No, I've heard of it.
So Dragnet, according to the internets, by which I mean Wikipedia, it was on the radio from 1949 to 57, and then it was on television from 51 to 59. The Naked City, you should really watch at some point. It's from 48, and it is, I'm going to get it wrong. I get things wrong. I got something wrong last week. I keep meaning to correct myself on. But it's the one that's basically like, there's 1,000 stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them.
Right. That one, yeah. And
so you should watch it at some point. And I feel like that's definitely a precursor.
Yeah, and it just feels like The Sniper belongs. I mean, I need to watch The Naked City, but like The Sniper is a really early basically it's about a serial killer. I guess he's a spree killer, but it's whatever. It's not these similar things. And there's
They
like
didn't
some
have
police
names for it
profiling.
then.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
was a little bit of
Well,
police
that was what
profiling.
blew my mind was the profiling, which I didn't think was. I mean, we just had Mindhunter as a TV show or a Netflix original series, and I think that mostly takes place in the late 70s.
I'll look that up.
And that's kind of considering the origins of profiling, and yet you totally, that one guy in The Sniper was doing some early profiling. Now it's all dated. I wouldn't go off of what they were coming up with, but
It's set roughly 77 to 80. I didn't look at it perfectly, but
right, because that's the thing we were noticing. I mean, when we think of serial killers, we're thinking of the guys of the 70s and 80s. I think there's like one or two in the 60s, but like you go back much further and like either they weren't around or we didn't know who they were. I mean,
well, there's a lot of, I've watched a certain number of shows where it discusses kind of like, well, this is probably the earliest serial killer. You know, there was probably a serial killer here. We don't know for sure because police work has evolved over the years, and they didn't used to keep track of things the way they do now. And so there probably was a similar percentage of serial killers like each decade, but we probably only started to really notice them in the 70s and 80s. At least that's my guess.
Yeah, it's hard to say. And there's a lot of talk about where the police started and why lately too.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Feeds into that.
Yeah. Well, and you were saying it's kind of interesting. You can finish this thought if you want, but it's like, even if you think specifically of like Ted Bundy and that other guy and how like our main guy is sort of dealt with in the same way, where it's like, he's just sort of pushed off and not really like.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about Bundy. I know the guy that Targets was based on. He would again be a spree killer because he just went up and shot people.
Yeah.
You know, one day. Like he had tried to call and get help and didn't get help, which they basically show in The Sniper.
Yeah.
But this is before that shooting. So I wonder if there was a case that someone knew about, where another case where that happened.
Yeah.
And I think it's also said that he was previously in mental, like he had just been.
Yeah, he'd been in for hurting someone or something.
Yeah, which is because that's like Ed Kemper, like there he had that again. Ed Kemper happens later, so I don't know. You know, to a degree, it's like we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, right? But it's not like no one knew what a pandemic was. Like people have been talking about pandemics for a while. I mean, we've had very stupid movies about pandemics for a while. So, you know, in that same sense, even if you don't necessarily have, you know, a Ted Bundy or a Dahmer targeted men, but still, it was still kind of sexual in nature. Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, he targeted women. It might still be something people are thinking about and like tangentially aware of. And, you know, a lot of how people with mental illness are dealt with over time, you know, has changed. I don't know what the thinking was in the 50s, but it's interesting to see this, like, basically we're too busy. We don't have enough resources. Like, yeah, was kind of, I mean,
I'm super curious. Like I'm not quite as into all this as you, but I almost wonder if there's like a history of sort of, I'm sure there's a bunch of books on profiling and serial killers and stuff like that. And I wonder if like this movie ever comes up, just like, do they ever?
It feels like it's not well known enough. And I mean, yeah, it feels like, yeah, it'd be nice for this movie to get better known, but I don't know how that would happen.
Well, a part of why we're even saying this is, aside from how interesting all of this sort of textual, cultural sort of textual information is, there's also, I invented that maybe. There's also like an aspect, there's also just like, it's well acted. Like I liked the guys in it.
Amazing photography of San Francisco. When I was complaining about Dirty Harry, one of your friends actually is like, well, San Francisco is notoriously hard to shoot in. The shots in Dirty Harry are amazing, And it's like, well, here, not that it negates Dirty Harry in any way, because it's different San Francisco at that point.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see this movie from.
Oh, totally. And there's lots of just great shots of San Francisco, and it's like, man, it's always fun to see a city. There's a difference, because I was watching something with I was watching a European city in like the early 30s. We'll get to that movie later. And like, it's interesting because unless it's Germany and it was a particular city, most of the cities in Europe have been relatively unchanged, unless you're talking about the suburbs. Sure, their things have changed, but there's a less change than, like, if you look at San Francisco. And then maybe this is a bad example, because San Francisco actually hasn't changed a ton since like
it's interesting
50s and 40s, but it's interesting how cities change, and just like even looking and like seeing people walking around, it's like the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I do want to help clarify that Germany is not the only country
yes.
in.
It's more just that Germany in World War II, there were not that many cities that were completely destroyed. And Germany has more, I think, than any other country.
Yeah.
France, I think, there were cities in France, like small villages, and we're not talking small villages were destroyed, but like bigger cities, bigger metropolitans were not really destroyed that much. But in like Dresden, Germany, like it doesn't look like the rest of Germany.
Yeah. Well, I remember being in Japan and going up a tall building big enough that you could really see the city, and you could see like one area where the streets are all kind of askew and narrow and so on, and they're like, didn't get bombed. Then you see this other area where everything is perfectly laid out, got bombed because it had been rebuilt, and it had been rebuilt kind of with more of a plan. It's interesting to bring up San Francisco, because the thing that always fascinates me about San Francisco is that it did get completely destroyed, not by a war, but by an earthquake.
Right.
So it feels very much of a certain time, because it was gone. Like the whole city, what the earthquake didn't knock down got burned down. So it does have an interesting look. But then, one of my things about what's that movie I watched? Freebie and the Bean. The Transamerica Pyramid had just been built in San Francisco. And boy, did they shoot the heck out of that thing. Like, someone was in love with that building. I posted about it. Just every shot. And it's very tall and pointed. And it just like got it. Like, it was just interesting.
Well, and other than the one part of the Sniper where it's actually Long Beach, and I think you and I both were like, oh, that looked familiar. I mean, in separate viewings. We didn't watch it together, just like in separate viewings.
The Pike isn't around anymore. It's the Long Beach amusement park.
Well, they still call it the Pike. That area is still called the Pike, or at least part of it is. Anyways, but it's like interesting. But like, there's just so many interesting shots in the movie, and on top, and again, acting's really good, and the story, like, there isn't a narrative, but like, you were talking the other day about how, like, if you wanted something different for the movie, it would change another part of the movie, and you like wouldn't want that to change, but like it's still lacking in this area, but then maybe we shouldn't worry about, like, this is a movie where it's like, it doesn't have a structured narrative, and I don't want it to, because it actually works better not having a structured narrative, because it's a little loose. Like, our guy's going descending into madness, so like what we see him doing, there's not really a great plot to it. It's kind of just things happening one after the other. Like, there is a plot, but it's like it's an escalation of tension and like stakes, and it does, that nice little exponential curve, and so the police are also kind of lost, and they are also having a curve like that. So it's not so much narrative, like plot story, it's more like theme. Like, it's not experimental or something, but it's like theme and character and theme and stakes are what is going along for us. Anyways,
well, I think we're kind of wrapping it up, but I want to so Edward, I'm going to give it my best try. Edward Dmytryk, he has literally no vowels that aren't Y's in his last name. Dmytryk. Dmytryk. I have actually seen a surprising number of his films, considering he did Murder My Sweet, which I really liked. I need to watch, It's a Raymond Chandler adaptation. It's, I think, the first one with Dick Powell as Marlowe. He did The Young Lions, which I watched a million years ago. And, I've been thinking about auteur theory more because Karina Longworth's been talking about it in relation to like Polly Platt and how much she contributed to her at the time husband Peter Bogdanovich's films. But the auteur theory kind of excludes a lot of people because it makes everything about the director. But I mean, it's kind of, to a degree, it is undeniable that the director has a lot of.
Usually the director has the biggest single influence on the film.
Right. But so like The Young Lions is a really, I watched it just in I guess befuddlement. It's got Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift in it. And it's a war film, and Marlon Brando is a Nazi. And it's just really interesting. So he did that and The Sniper. Looking over his list of film, his most famous one is The Caine Mutiny, which I think which our mother told me to watch because I'm not a huge Humphrey Bogart fan. Don't come at me. It's fine. He's fine. I'm just not a huge Bogart fan. And she's like, watch The Caine Mutiny. And I'm like, oh, that's by this director I keep running into that I kind of like.
I've heard of The Caine Mutiny, and I've just, in film talk somewhere, and I've been wanting to watch it. So
he did Crossfire, which I think I mentioned last week on this as the one that kind of got pushed to the side in favor of A Gentleman's Agreement is what I remember. I'm going off of memory here. And amongst his other movies is something called Hitler's Children, which is potentially worrisome. It's from 1943. It's listed as drama/propaganda, so that could be interesting. But anyway, I wonder why we don't talk about him. Because it seems like he has an interesting film. But then again, I mean, there's times where the reasons we don't talk about people are genuinely sinister. They're women, they're Black. We just say, oh, what they did wasn't important.
Right.
There's times where I think just people speak more to one generation than another. Like, I personally watched Buster Keaton become more popular than he was years ago.
Yeah.
And I think it's just because he appeals more to modern audiences than he did to some older audiences.
I even wonder if it's like he appealed to a generation or two ago, even because, like, let's say in the 80s or 90s, he still wasn't a recent star or anything. But like, if you watch Jackie Chan movies and a lot of people like Jackie Chan and listen to Jackie Chan talk, Jackie Chan was a big Buster Keaton fan.
Yeah.
So like that might even contribute to, a resurgence of Keaton.
Well, and I would say
or something like that.
Dmytryk he's not showy. He's not like
he's a lot more like he's who's like a modern equivalent to that, because I personally like showy directors, so I think more of them in my mind, but he's not an Orson
Welles. He's not doing, but he's got these little things, and that's where, like, one of my favorite directors, because I don't necessarily glom onto a director's whole body of work. But like John Carpenter, like, he's got some real whatever, Ghosts of Mars, fine. Yeah. But he's got this like interesting group of just kind of like during the 80s, just solid films that just had a certain kind of weirdness, and sometimes like The Thing, but
yeah,
they were all interesting. Like,
yeah, this makes me curious to see more Edric Dmytryk, and I've just watched 2 of the noirs by Phil Carlston, I think is his name. And it's like, I'm even just curious, like, oh, those were just well-made movies and they were interesting and they weren't great. But I'm curious, like, is this a Hollywood, guy, a Hollywood journeyman? Like, it's, there's a lot of, we think that history doesn't get lost as much as it does.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm definitely curious to see more. I want to see The Caine Mutiny and Crossfire. And at some point I just have to figure out what Hitler's Children is actually about.
Yeah, I'm a little curious. I'm cautiously, tentatively curious about that one.
Yeah, I mean, I do, from reading his, my extensive research reading Dmytryk's Wikipedia, he did get caught up in the House Un-American Committee HUAC stuff, where at first he refused to speak and then he did, so he's not quite as in, but you know,
one of the guys he cast,
everybody still talks about Elia Kazan stuff, even though a lot of people are disgusted with him at this point. So
and one of the people in The Sniper is Alfred Minjo or Alfred something. He's the detective, the older detective, and he is like, I looked at his Wikipedia page, and he does not sound like a good guy. Like, he was super into, like, he was like, he's probably the kind of like super conservative that most conservatives look at and are like, I don't know that guy, because he like was really into he was like big on HUAC. He sounded like kind of like he might have been a little bit of a vile person.
Yeah, Adolphe Menjou. It's funny, it says he's an American actor and he was born in Pittsburgh, but that name looks very French, and I don't pronounce French very well. So
yeah. Anyways, that's all I've got for The Sniper.